At 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 days ago, the Canadian government simultaneously activated comprehensive trade agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and China. Agreements that had been negotiated in secret over the preceding 3 months while Washington was focused on issuing threats. By 9:47 a.m., the first market reactions were visible. Canadian commodity futures shifted. European procurement orders redirected. Asian shipping contracts activated. By 10:30 a.m., American lumber futures spiked 12% as traders realized that Canadian supply, the supply that American construction companies had treated as permanent, reliable, and captive, was being redirected to Asian markets at premium prices. By noon, the U.S. Trade Representative's office had convened an emergency meeting. The question on the table: how did this happen without us seeing it? By 2 p.m., Warren Buffett, the most respected investor in the history of American capitalism, gave an interview that didn't make major headlines in American media, but that Canadian media broadcast wall to wall. And what he said landed in Washington like a guided munition. When you have a trade relationship that's worked for 75 years and you decide to blow it up based on impulse and incomplete information, the market teaches you lessons. Expensive lessons. We're seeing that now. Expensive lessons. From a man who measures expense in the context of hundreds of billions of dollars. From a man whose definition of expensive means structural damage. The kind that compounds, the kind that doesn't reverse when the policy changes, the kind that reshapes industries and power dynamics for decades. And here's what makes this devastating for Washington. Buffett wasn't describing a future risk. He was describing a present reality. American companies right now today are facing supply chain disruptions costing them billions. Not millions, billions, because they built their entire operations around an assumption that just collapsed. The assumption that Canadian resources would always be available, always affordable, always flowing south, because where else would they go? Mark Carney just answered that question, and the answer is everywhere except south. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through exactly how Carney executed what trade analysts are calling the most significant economic realignment in North American history, how he built it, how he deployed it, and why Washington didn't see it coming despite watching it happen. I'm going to show you the specific sectors where American businesses are already hemorrhaging: lumber, automotive, pharmaceuticals, energy, with numbers that make the damage concrete and undeniable. I'm going to reveal why Buffett's warning carries more weight than any government analysis, and why American CEOs are already acting on it by repositioning their investments away from U.S.-Canada trade exposure. I'm going to explain the institutional response in Washington, the emergency meetings, the scrambled briefings, the dawning realization that the leverage America relied on for 75 years has evaporated, and why the U.S. government has no effective counter-strategy. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what North American trade looks like 6 months from now, because the decisions being made this week will determine whether this economic realignment is temporary or permanent, and every indicator suggests it's permanent. Subscribe to join the community. Leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going. And share this video, because what happened 3 days ago doesn't just affect trade statistics. It affects every American who buys a house, fills a prescription, heats their home, or drives a car. The prices are already moving, and they're moving in one direction. Let me walk you through the system that just broke, because to understand why this matters, why it matters more than any single tariff dispute or trade negotiation in the past half-century, you have to understand the infrastructure of dependency that the United States built with Canada over 75 years. And then you have to understand how Mark Carney dismantled it in 90 days. The U.S.-Canada trade relationship is not a normal bilateral trading partnership. It is the most deeply integrated economic relationship between 2 nations on Earth. More integrated than the U.S. and Mexico, more integrated than France and Germany, more integrated than any 2 economies that maintain separate currencies and separate governments. Approximately 75% of Canadian exports have traditionally flowed south into American markets. 3/4 of everything Canada produces that it sells internationally, going to one customer. This created an assumption in Washington that was so deeply held, so universally accepted, so thoroughly embedded in every economic model and every strategic assessment and every negotiating position that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. Say it enough times, write it into enough briefing papers, build enough policy decisions on it, and it stops being an assumption. It becomes an axiom, a law of nature, something that cannot be different because it has never been different. 75 years, 3/4 of a century, that's how long this assumption has governed North American trade. That's how long American negotiators have walked into meetings with Canadian counterparts knowing that the other side had no alternative, that the pipeline pointed south, that the lumber flowed south, that the energy flowed south, that the pharmaceutical ingredients flowed south, because where else would they go? And for 75 years, that assumption was correct. Not because Canada was weak, not because Canada lacked ambition, because the infrastructure pointed south. The pipelines, the rail lines, the highways, the shipping routes, the trade agreements, the regulatory harmonization, the just-in-time supply chains calibrated to the hour, all of it, every physical and institutional system was built around the assumption of southward flow. And changing the direction of flow requires building new infrastructure. New relationships, new contracts, new regulatory frameworks, new shipping routes, that takes years, decades even, which is why the assumption felt permanent. And then Mark Carney arrived, and he didn't need decades. He needed 3 months. Here's what Carney did, and this is where the strategic brilliance becomes clear, because the brilliance isn't in any single deal. It's in the architecture. The way every piece connects to every other piece. The way the system works as a whole, even if any individual component faces resistance. For 3 months, while Trump was tweeting threats, while American pundits debated tariff rates, while Trump's advisors reassured each other that Canada would fold, Carney's government was conducting simultaneous negotiations with multiple major economies, not sequentially, not one at a time, simultaneously, with different partners on different continents, across different sectors, all at once. The European Union, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and the one that sent Washington into absolute panic mode, China. Each negotiation was sector-specific. Each agreement was designed to redirect a specific Canadian export from the American market to an alternative buyer. Each contract was structured with terms that made the redirection economically rational, not just politically symbolic, but financially superior to the old arrangement. And here's the critical design principle, the one that transforms this from trade diversification into strategic architecture. The agreements were activated simultaneously, not announced one at a time over weeks or months, giving Washington time to respond, to counter, to apply pressure on individual partners. All at once, in a single morning, every deal, every contract, every new trade flow activated together. The effect was an economic detonation, not a single explosion that could be contained. A simultaneous detonation across multiple sectors and multiple geographies that made containment impossible. By the time the U.S. Trade Representative's office understood what had happened, it was already operational. The contracts were signed, the shipping was rerouted, the new infrastructure was activated, the alternative architecture was live. Trump's advisors had seen the negotiations happening. Intelligence briefings mentioned them. Diplomatic cables noted the increased activity. But they interpreted what they saw through the lens of their assumption, the assumption that Canada had no real alternative, that these negotiations were posturing, that Carney was building bargaining chips for the inevitable moment when Canada came back to Washington to negotiate. They assumed Canada was bluffing because they assumed Canada had to be bluffing, because the alternative, that Canada was actually building a functional trade architecture that could operate without the United States, didn't fit inside their model of how the world works. The model was wrong. And the cost of being wrong is now being measured in billions of dollars of disrupted American business. Let me give you the specific numbers, sector by sector, because this is where the damage becomes concrete, where trade policy stops being abstract and starts being the price you pay at the store, the availability of your medication, the cost of heating your home. Lumber. Canadian lumber has been a cornerstone of American construction for decades. The wood that builds American homes, the material that keeps housing affordable, or at least less unaffordable than it would otherwise be. Canadian lumber is close, reliable, high quality, and, crucially, has historically been cheap. Cheap because Canadian producers had limited options. The pipeline pointed south. The buyer was America, and a captive seller doesn't get to charge premium prices. That captivity just ended. Canadian lumber is now being redirected to Asian construction markets, specifically to buyers in China, Japan, and South Korea who are willing to pay higher prices than what American companies were paying. Not slightly higher, significantly higher. Because Asian construction is booming, because Asian buyers value supply security, because Asian contracts are longer term and more stable than the volatile American market under a president who changes trade policy based on morning television, the U.S. construction industry is projecting a 17% increase in material costs over the next fiscal quarter. 17%. Not from general inflation, not from labor costs, not from regulatory changes, specifically from Canadian lumber either being unavailable or substantially more expensive because it's going to buyers who pay more and threaten less. 17% on construction materials cascades through the entire housing market. Builder costs go up, home prices go up, renovation costs go up, commercial construction costs go up. Every project becomes more expensive. Some projects become unprofitable. Some get canceled. Workers who would have been hired for those projects don't get hired. And the timeline for reversing this? There isn't one. Because the Asian contracts are signed, multi-year agreements with committed volumes, with penalty clauses for non-delivery. Canadian lumber producers can't redirect back to American buyers even if they wanted to, not without breaching contracts with Asian partners who will enforce those contracts legally. Path dependency. The lumber is gone, the contracts are locked, the infrastructure is redirecting, and American construction is paying 17% more, starting now. Automotive. The North American auto industry is, or was, the most integrated cross-border manufacturing system in the world. A single vehicle assembled in the United States might contain components that cross the Canadian border 7 times during production. Stamped steel from Ontario to Michigan, back to Ontario for machining, back to Michigan for assembly, back to Ontario for a subsystem, back to Michigan for final integration. The just-in-time supply chain that makes this possible was built over decades, calibrated to the hour, optimized for efficiency, and completely dependent on the assumption that the border is friction-free and the parts are always available. Canadian auto parts suppliers are now shifting production to serve European and Asian contracts. Contracts that Carney's government helped broker. Contracts with better terms, longer durations, and more stability than what Trump's America was offering. An America where tariff policy changes based on presidential mood, and where today's trade agreement might be tomorrow's trade war. The big three, Ford, GM, Stellantis, are facing parts shortages for the first time in modern history. Not hypothetical shortages, not projected shortages, actual shortages. Assembly lines in Michigan and Ohio are experiencing delays that haven't been seen in decades. A factory cannot build a car without all the parts. And when a critical Canadian component is being shipped to a BMW plant in Germany instead of a Ford plant in Dearborn, because the German contract is better and the German buyer doesn't threaten tariffs, the Ford assembly line doesn't slow down. It stops. Production slowdowns mean layoffs, mean overtime crunches as companies try to maintain output with incomplete supply, mean vehicle prices rising as fewer units reach dealer lots, mean consumers paying more for the trucks and cars they need for daily life. Pharmaceuticals. Canada produces a significant percentage of the generic medications that Americans rely on. Blood pressure drugs, diabetes medications, cholesterol treatments, antibiotics, the affordable versions of drugs that would otherwise cost 10 or 20 times as much from brand name manufacturers. Those medications now have preferential access to EU markets. Under the agreements Carney negotiated, Canadian pharmaceutical companies have committed supply volumes to European health systems, systems that purchase in bulk, systems that offer stable, long-term contracts, systems that don't threaten the supplier's home country with 25% tariffs while simultaneously expecting preferential supply. American pharmacies are already reporting supply constraints on 17 different generic drugs, 17 medications that Americans take every day for conditions that require daily treatment, conditions where missing doses isn't an inconvenience, it's a medical emergency. The drugs exist, they're being manufactured, they're being shipped. They're just being shipped to Europe first because the European contracts are more stable, more profitable, and less likely to be disrupted by the kind of policy volatility that has defined the Trump administration's approach to trade. Energy. This is where Trump's miscalculation is most devastating, because the energy dependency between the US and Canada isn't just about supply volume, it's about infrastructure. Trump believed that American energy independence meant the US didn't need Canadian oil and natural gas. And in aggregate production numbers, the United States produces a lot of energy domestically. That's true. But production and delivery are not the same thing. The infrastructure, the pipelines, the refineries, the distribution systems, the heating networks was built around Canadian imports, particularly in the northern states. Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, states where winter isn't optional, where heating your home is the difference between comfort and hypothermia. You can't redirect pipeline flow overnight. You can't reconfigure a refinery that was designed for Canadian heavy crude to process a different grade in a week. You can't build new distribution infrastructure in a month. Canadian energy is being rerouted through new pipeline agreements to overseas buyers with long-term contracts that lock in supply for years. Contracts that Canadian producers are fulfilling first because those contracts are binding, because those relationships are new and need to be honored, because the buyers on the other end are paying premium prices. Michigan and Minnesota are facing energy cost increases that are already hitting consumers. Home heating costs up 22% month over month, 22%. In states where heating costs are already a significant portion of household budgets. In communities where many families are already stretching to cover basic expenses, 22% more. Because the natural gas that used to flow south from Alberta is now flowing west to Pacific export terminals or east to Atlantic shipment. Governors in both states have publicly called out Trump's trade policy, not opposition governors making partisan attacks, governors dealing with real economic pain in their states. Pain caused by decisions made in Washington without consulting anyone who understands how integrated the US-Canada energy infrastructure actually is. And here's where Warren Buffett's diagnosis becomes critical, because Buffett isn't just observing the damage, he's explaining why the damage is structural, why it won't reverse when the political winds change, why the expensive lesson is going to be far more expensive than most people realize. Buffett understands something about economic relationships that most politicians, and certainly this president, do not. He understands that trade relationships are not transactions. They are systems built over decades, based on trust, based on reliability, based on the assumption that the relationship is stable enough to invest in. When a company builds a factory in Michigan designed to receive Canadian steel, that company is investing millions, sometimes hundreds of millions, based on the assumption that Canadian steel will be available, affordable, and reliably delivered for the lifetime of that factory. When a hospital in Minnesota signs a contract for heating fuel, that contract is based on the assumption that Canadian natural gas will flow through existing pipelines at predictable prices. When a pharmacy chain stocks Canadian generic medications, that stocking decision is based on the assumption that supply will be continuous and reliable. Every one of those assumptions has now been violated, not by Canada, by the United States, by threatening tariffs that disrupted the assumption of stability, by creating policy volatility that made every Canadian supplier question whether the American market was worth the risk. And when those assumptions are violated, the investments based on them lose value. The factory designed for Canadian steel faces a redesign. The heating contract faces renegotiation at higher prices. The pharmacy faces shortages. But here's the part Buffett understands that makes this truly devastating. The replacement investments, the new factories, the new contracts, the new supply relationships are now being made in Canada's new partner countries. European companies are investing in Canadian supply chains. Asian manufacturers are building relationships with Canadian suppliers. The investment capital that used to flow into US-Canada trade infrastructure is being redirected to Canada-EU, Canada-Asia, Canada, everywhere except America infrastructure. And that investment creates its own gravity, its own path dependency. Once a European automaker has retooled a factory to receive Canadian steel instead of using American intermediated supply, that factory doesn't switch back. The retooling cost is sunk. The new relationship is established. The logistics are configured. Trust is an economic asset, Buffett said. Reliability is an economic asset. Predictability is an economic asset. And we've squandered those assets in pursuit of short-term political messaging that doesn't even hold up to economic scrutiny. Trust, reliability, predictability. Three things the United States used to offer. Three things that made America the center of the world's most important trade relationships. Three things that Donald Trump's tariff threats and Mark Carney's strategic response to them have transferred from the United States to Canada. When Buffett says expensive lesson, he's not talking about the direct cost of lumber or pharmaceuticals or energy. He's talking about the cost of credibility, the intangible asset that takes 75 years to build and 90 days to destroy. American credibility in trade relationships is now damaged, not temporarily, structurally. Every country that negotiates with the United States going forward will remember what happened with Canada, will build protections against American unpredictability, will be less willing to make their economies dependent on U.S. markets, will demand exit clauses and alternative provisions and hedging strategies that didn't exist before. That loss of credibility has a cost, a massive, diffuse, compounding cost that affects every trade negotiation, every investment decision, every strategic partnership the United States tries to build for the next 20 years. And that cost is Buffett's expensive lesson, not the lumber, not the drugs, not the energy, the trust. Here's what happened in Washington. Because the institutional response tells you everything about how badly the U.S. government was caught off guard and how few options remain. At 9:15 a.m. on the day the agreements went live, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office received formal notification from Canadian counterparts. The notification included summaries of each agreement, the sectors affected, and the timeline for implementation. The trade representative convened an emergency meeting within the hour. The question on the table: can the United States block any of these agreements? The answer from legal counsel: no. Canada has the sovereign right to negotiate trade agreements with any partner. The United States cannot prevent bilateral agreements between Canada and the EU, or Canada and Japan, or Canada and any other country. The United States can impose tariffs on Canadian goods entering the American market, but that's the tool that created this crisis in the first place. Additional tariffs would only accelerate the redirection of Canadian exports to markets where tariffs don't exist. Every tariff increase makes the American market less attractive relative to the alternatives Carney just created. The weapon that was supposed to give America leverage now makes America's position worse every time it's deployed. At 10 sour a.m., the National Economic Council convened. The economic impact assessment was delivered within 2 hours, and the numbers, according to sources, produced the kind of silence that settles over a room when the people in it realize they have no good options. The 40% reduction in Canadian trade dependency on the United States translates to approximately $280 billion in annual trade flows being redirected away from American markets. Not immediately. The full redirection takes 2 years, according to Canadian projections. But the trajectory is set. The contracts are signed. The first redirections are already operational. $280 billion in trade flows that American businesses were counting on, that American supply chains were built around, that American economic projections assumed would continue indefinitely, gone. Not to nowhere, to Europe, to Asia, to partners who offered better terms and more respect, but gone from the American economy. At 11:30 a.m., the Commerce Department began receiving calls from industry associations, construction, automotive, pharmaceutical, energy, all asking the same question. What is the government going to do about this? The honest answer, the answer that nobody in Washington wants to give publicly, is nothing. There is nothing the U.S. government can do to force Canada to maintain trade flows that Canada has already contractually committed to other partners. There is nothing the U.S. can do to make Canadian lumber cheaper when it's being sold at premium prices to Asian buyers. There is nothing the U.S. can do to make Canadian pharmaceutical companies prioritize American pharmacies when they have binding contracts with European health systems. The leverage is gone. The alternatives are built. The contracts are signed. And the United States, the country that assumed it held all the cards, is discovering that the deck has been reshuffled while it wasn't looking. At 1 p.m., Trump was briefed. According to sources, Trump was told that Canada has activated comprehensive trade agreements with multiple major economies, that Canadian exports are being redirected away from the United States, that American businesses are facing supply disruptions and cost increases across multiple sectors, that Warren Buffett has publicly criticized the administration's trade approach. Trump reportedly asked whether the U.S. could retaliate by cutting off all trade with Canada. His advisors explained, reportedly with the weary patience of people who have explained basic economic reality to this president many times before, that cutting off trade with Canada would devastate American industries that depend on Canadian inputs, that American refineries need Canadian crude, that American factories need Canadian steel, that American pharmacies need Canadian medications, that American construction needs Canadian lumber. Cutting off Canadian trade doesn't punish Canada. It punishes America. Trump reportedly suggested threatening additional tariffs. His trade team explained that threatening tariffs against a country that has just reduced its dependency on your market by 40% is like threatening to hold your breath against someone who has already learned to breathe underwater. The threat only works if the other side needs your market. Canada just proved it doesn't. Trump then reportedly tried to call Carney directly to negotiate, to cut a deal, to use the personal touch that he believes can solve any problem if he can just get the other leader on the phone. Carney's office released a statement, polite, professional, devastating in its implications. The Prime Minister's schedule does not permit a call at this time. Diplomatic channels remain open for formal negotiations. That's a brush-off. Every diplomat in the world recognized it as such. Every trade analyst understood what it meant. It meant we're not negotiating bilaterally. We're not giving you the personal, unstructured, personality-driven conversation where American size and American presidential charisma create an asymmetry. We're negotiating through formal channels where preparation matters, where facts matter, where the side with better alternatives has the advantage, and that side is Canada. Mark Carney gave a press conference 2 days ago, very measured, very professional, no gloating, no celebration, no triumphalism, just a simple, calm statement that contained a sentence that should keep every American trade strategist awake at night. Canada remains open to fair trade relationships with all partners, including the United States, but we will not negotiate from a position of manufactured crisis. We've built economic resilience, and we're prepared to maintain our course. That last line. We're prepared to maintain our course. Parse that diplomatically, and you hear what every trade analyst heard, what every diplomat heard, what every intelligence officer heard. We don't need you anymore. Not we don't want you. Not we're punishing you. Not we're angry. We don't need you. 5 words that represent the total collapse of American leverage over Canada. 5 words that took 3 months of quiet diplomacy to earn the right to say. 5 words that Trump's entire strategy was designed to prevent, and 5 words that are now the reality of the U.S.-Canada relationship. Let me give you 3 scenarios for what happens next, because the decisions being made this week by Trump, by Carney, by corporate leaders, by investors, by the millions of Americans and Canadians whose lives depend on how this plays out, will determine whether this economic realignment is a temporary disruption or a permanent restructuring.